BierTalk. Gespräche über und beim Bier. Hello and warmly welcome to our new podcast, BierTalk. Today we start a new experiment and it will be a beer talk in English because normally our podcast is broadcasted in German, but now we have American guests and also a very interesting American topic. And so the idea was, why not do it in English? So we try this today. I hope you will understand everything. Of course, you can write us and we can answer you. And now we go deep into the story. We go to Oregon in the Pacific Northwest, and there we meet the archaeologist Chelsea Rose from the Southern Oregon University and Tiah Edmunson-Morton, curator of the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives in Corvallis, also in Oregon. We will be talking about the Pacific Northwest brewing history, which is very interesting and maybe also new for you, but not new for our two guests. So could you please introduce yourself shortly to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Chelsea Rose. I'm a historical archaeologist based in Southern Oregon, and my research really focuses on the settlement and the development of the American West. And so breweries and saloons are just one part of that kind of interesting story that I like to deconstruct using archaeology.
And my name is Tiah Edmunson-Morton, and I'm an archivist, and I work at Oregon State University at the library's Special Collections and Archives Research Center there. I started the Hops and Brewing Archives in 2013, and I do normal archiving stuff. So I put things in boxes and I write guides to collections, but I'm also working on a book about women and brewing in the 19th century in Oregon.
So that really sounds very interesting. We're talking about brewing, about saloons, about all these good old times. And maybe first we talk a little bit, what is your actual personal relationship to beer?
I don't really like it. I'm embarrassed to admit I'm more of a wine person or whiskey person, but I do really appreciate the microbrewery culture in the Pacific Northwest. I think that's really been a nice addition to, options for going out, but I usually order something else.
That's the punchline to every joke for me too, that I also really like wine. I do like cider and I like a good sour beer. I think that's something that I've learned the more that I've gotten to taste lots of different beers. I like sour beers. But I will say that my interest in beer history, agricultural history is definitely academic. But my great-great-grandpa and his brother also grew hops in Eugene, which is about 45 minutes south of where I am in Corvallis, in the early 20th century. So I do have some family connections agricultural wise.
So that really sounds good. And I would say we are halfway there, because if you already drink wine and spirits and like cider and all these things, there are lots of beers which are quite close to that and maybe can catch you and also bring you into beer and brewing. But also, I think it's very interesting if you say you have a professional approach, a scientific approach to brewing, which is also maybe better than only a drinking approach, I would say. Okay. Maybe let's talk how you did come across the idea of researching on breweries and doing archaeology, doing excavation, which really sounds interesting for us. How did it come? How did you come to this idea?
Well, the Eagle Brewery and Saloon, which we excavated this fall, is located in a little town called Jacksonville, Oregon. And it's a really well-preserved kind of 19th century landscape. A lot of the buildings survived up till today. And this private parcel where the brewery, the remains of the brewery is owned by these two gentlemen that hired us to take a look at what kind of archaeology might be on this property, because they recognized the historical significance of the property. And they wanted to make sure that the archaeology present would be taken into account in some subdividing, because it's quite a large parcel right in town. And so there's plenty of room to put other houses and stuff in there. And they wanted to look into that because they figured if they didn't do it, the next owner would. And they really wanted to make sure it was done the right way, with the heritage of this brewery in mind. So we came out and developed a plan to see what was there, where it is on the landscape, what we would want to make sure was protected in the development, and what areas they could build roads and houses or whatever they needed to on. And so that was kind of how we ended up at this site. But I've been, as I mentioned, I've had a long interest in saloons and breweries, and, come across them quite regularly. And there's other ones in town that I've kind of had my eye on in addition to this one. So when this opportunity came up, it was really exciting because, that's just one of the really fun dream projects if you want to look into the myths of the Wild West. And in doing this research, I came across Tiah's work, which overlapped just so beautifully. And it became clear that not only was this a really cool project because it allowed us an opportunity to interrogate some of the myths of the Wild West surrounding breweries and saloons, but there's this woman at the heart of this story, and Tiah had been doing this research to kind of uncover her part of it, and that just made it even more interesting to me.
Yeah, that really sounds great. Maybe first a short question. If you think on archaeology, you always think about digging. So how deep did you have to go to find something?
Yeah, so well, in archaeology in the US, it's not uncommon for us to do stuff that's much more recent than probably in Germany or other places around the world. So sometimes the stuff we're looking for is even on the surface or, not very deep. So this property, we didn't have to dig very deep to find what we were looking for. And in fact, one of the main research questions we had was this rock pile that's just right there on the surface. And it was really easy to see that these rocks were put there with intention, and they represented part of a building that was formerly there. So it was pretty easy to start off with like, hey, dig here. And when I say dig, a lot of that really entailed moving rocks in that particular spot. So it totally varies. If you're down in an area where flooding happens, things can be quite deep. If you're in an area where there's a lot of erosion or wind-blown sediment, stuff can be pretty close to the surface. So the depth isn't always correlated to age here in Oregon. So
one last question about that. I read that you also had to look at the fire insurance records to find exactly the places. Is that a common approach?
Yeah. So we not only dig through the dirt, but we dig through the archives wherever we can and take any artifacts of the past that we can into consideration. And so one really important clue to the past and the way cities and homes were set up, especially in the late 19th century, are what are called Sanborn fire insurance maps. And that is somebody came along and recorded your building, what size it was, what materials it was made, was it wood, was it brick, with the purpose of insuring it against fire. So that means that some buildings are more carefully recorded than others, depending on who has insurance or not. But it is nonetheless a really great record of what's historically on a parcel. So we have several different years for the Eagle Brewery and Saloon parcel, and we can kind of track what was there, what kind of, it's not perfect, but it kind of gives us a lot of clues. What was there? What was its function? How was the property laid out? And then archaeology, one of the fun things is we fill in the gaps. We can confront or corroborate evidence, other lines of evidence. And so we don't take that as like the ultimate truth, but it's definitely a really important clue that we work with to try to tell the story.
Yeah, maybe Tiah, you can also explain a little bit from the side of the archivist or of the curator, and maybe also, if we already mentioned, it's also about women, your research. So did that also take place in the 19th century? Because if I think of all the movies I've seen, I never saw a female brewer in any of these movies. So what were your findings?
Yeah, well, and I love to dig in my yard. And so when Chelsea said that they were doing an archaeology dig, I was very excited. It was very different from digging in my yard. It was very different from weeding. I think I wanted to clean everything up. And that was not my task. But I was excited to really look at this overlap between what would have been happening in a domestic setting, like a house, and for the Eagle Brewery in particular, Well, and really for 19th century breweries, period, in Oregon, there was often a really close proximity of the house and the brewery, or the house and the saloon. So to be able to be in that space where somebody lived that I was researching, but also to just have a kind of visual aid, I guess, to think about how far the house was, or where the what would it have been like to walk out to do this business, and to see how close the house was to the brewery business sort of confirmed in my mind this idea that these were family businesses, and that the man's name maybe was on the record of the license, or was on that Sanborn map, or in an advertisement in a newspaper, that there was no way that this could have been separate, that this home life and this business life could have been separate. So I think you are right in what we see in history, or what we see in more popular culture about history, and the women definitely were involved in 19th century Oregon. Women have been involved for a very long time. And so the idea that men are the brewers is actually a relatively new construct. That wasn't always the case. In lots of different cultures and lots of different eras, women were the brewers because brewing was an aspect of house and food management, or the duties that were related to keeping the house more broadly. And so a lot of the women who were brewers in medieval England or in ancient times, they were often displaced by industrialization. So as breweries became more profitable, and as brewers became trained and professionals, that was often when women were excluded, that they didn't have the paths to get loans, or to get education, or to join brewing guilds, as was the case in England. And so they were just excluded from the evolving industry. And I think it's often about profit. It's often always about profit. And I think what we're left with is often this sense that men have always done this work. And in Oregon, like I said, we can talk more later about what the industry was in Oregon more generally. But in Oregon, the customers of these mid-19th century breweries were almost always local. These were small establishments. They were small businesses. Family members were involved in lots of different ways. And these were family businesses. So what we're left with is the story of men working with men, or men drinking with men. But the reality is that women's work had always contributed to the family venture. And to kind of bring it back full circle to this dig, to see that these were literally, I'm trying to think of how many feet it would have been, or how many yards it would be. It's not very far from the back door of the house, where the house was, to the back door, or the front door of where the brewery was. There were vastly more Germans than any other group of people making beer in Oregon, like vastly more. The thing is, though, is that by the time people arrived in Oregon, by the time the people who became the brewers arrived in Oregon, they, for the most part, already were brewers. So they arrived with commercial enterprises in mind. And that doesn't mean that women didn't make beer for home consumption, or maybe for like local trading, but it doesn't seem like there was the same displacement that happened. It did happen on the East Coast in colonial times, for sure, that there were women in the colonies who started to operate taverns, or run smaller breweries, and then the same thing happened to them. But it doesn't seem like that was the case in Oregon. I haven't been able to find any direct records from the women who were in Oregon at that time related to brewing. I'm hopeful that there would be some diaries at the university that's maybe, again, the other major university just south of me in Eugene. They have a big collection of mid 19th century diaries there that I want to go look at. But COVID meant that I wasn't able to. So it's possible that there'll be some records of people who were doing home brewing that was then they were selling or bartering at some level, but it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, maybe also we talk about, you mentioned it, a lot of Germans coming to the country in these times, and we already talked about that it's the time of the gold rush. But you also said that people came and had already their business in mind, so they not only came maybe for gold digging. And I don't know if you know, I'm from Bamberg, Germany, which is in the southern part of the country, and only a few kilometers away from here lived the Strauss family. And a guy went to San Francisco, Levi Strauss, and he invented the famous trousers. So also quite interesting history. We also have a museum here which covers that. And so maybe what role did brewing have in this gold rush era? Were there really brewers coming and say, okay, we want to make beer for the people who dig for gold? Or were there people which came for digging and then decided, okay, maybe we do better, we do beer? What do you think?
I'll give the short answer first, and then Chelsea can give the much longer answer because she knows much more. The brewers, a lot of them were chasing gold. They were living in Colorado or California or Idaho before coming to Oregon to settle. So there definitely is a very, very direct connection between people who were miners and then people who became brewers. But also the miners like to drink. That's my shorter answer.
Yeah. And I would just say that, the first thing is everybody wanted to come out and get rich quick mining from all over the world. And a lot of times it was to get that seed money to start some other enterprise. Nobody really thought they were going to have a career forever in mining. But one of the things that many people realized right away was you could make a lot more money and more consistently by mining the miners, so to speak. So if you could set up some kind of enterprise that could give those miners a very handy way to spend that gold dust and those gold nuggets, you would just make way more money, way more consistently. So I think that's where a lot of these enterprises kind of came into play that way. But it was a really unique moment it's really a global event that happened because so many people moved in a really short amount of time from all over the world to this one kind of area. And, Oregon being just north of California, we were just, the gold rush made its way up here within a few short years of the first strike in California, bringing lots of folks, lots of disruption to the native peoples that have been living here. And it really had a huge impact on, the way that this landscape changed really quickly. And one of the things that was interesting, especially in Southern Oregon, is the miners came, the businesses came like that before there was even really laws. It wasn't even a territory here. In fact, it was sovereign native land at that time. But people came and they built breweries and saloons, and so kind of the shenanigans surrounding that became some of the first laws that people realized, hey, we have to kind of rein in some of this. And I don't know if you've come across some of that, Tiah, I know there's definitely, things targeting violence and all that kind of stuff, but who could have a saloon, what you had to pay for it. They tried to pretty quickly get on top of some of that, which is another really interesting aspect of this.
Yeah, and I think that's something that makes it really challenging for those earliest breweries is we want something to be the first, or we want a record of something being the first or second. And it's really, really hard. It's hard because those systems of government were not yet in place and the tracking was not yet in place. I think it's very likely that there were breweries that were essentially opening concurrently, but they weren't licensed, or they weren't official in the sense of having they weren't complying maybe with federal regulations. So I think that's the lack of records from that time is really challenging. And I will also say that on the north part of the country, the northwest part of the country, that same sort of extractive work was happening, but it was fishing, the early setting up in the northwest part of Oregon, where, again, some of those other early breweries or early alcohol establishments were being established, was wherever there was industry, and that industry meant displacement of the people who were there, because there certainly were people in all of these places where these industries set up.
Maybe a short question on data. How many people came in the gold rush, and where did they come from?
Yeah, and that's a tricky one to answer too, for the exact reason that the records are not great. But I think I read recently that some folks are thinking like 300,000 came to California in the initial stages of the gold rush. But the answer is complicated because it depends on how narrowly you define the gold rush, because some scholars would consider it just California, just between these few years. And then Oregon had its own gold rush starting in the 1850s on. So it's one of those questions that's really hard to answer. But a lot of folks came in really quickly, and it was a pretty abrupt shift to these landscapes. And folks came from all over the world, and a lot of them had different motivations. There was, of course, plenty of people already here. And yeah, it was a really global phenomenon. And some people always intended to come and make money and take it back to the East Coast or back home to wherever they came from. And others really saw it as an opportunity to, advance settler colonialism and build their empire in this quote unquote, new territory that they thought was empty and that they could fill with, whatever they wanted to. So there was a lot. It was a really complex time, and it's hard for me to give a solid figures on what that looked like.
Well, and I think the one thing that I have been surprised about, I just finished a huge data project. I looked through the census records from 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, and then sort of did some spot searching and review in those in the later years until Prohibition, and look through city directories, trying to identify actual brewers, seeing how many brewers there were. And I was really surprised at how few people stayed for more than one census cycle. So there were, of nearly 600 people that I've identified, only 40 of those were actually here, 40-ish were here for more than one census cycle. So that it was a really transitory business. I think people would stay for a few years and then go somewhere else. I don't know where where that else would be.
Yeah, maybe they stayed in the States and went somewhere else. But before, you mentioned there were a lot of Germans. So is that in the records? Can you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. So many Germans. I wish I had the percentage in front of me. I was looking to see if I actually had it in my notes. It was something really close to like 75% there earlier on, certainly.
In the brewing industry.
In the brewing industry, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And there were people who were from Austria or from Switzerland, or from the part of France that is closest to Germany. So they definitely were coming from that region, even if their country of their home country wasn't Germany.
That's the other side of it, because at the time in the 1850s there was no Germany at all. So it was all these little member states, and so you cannot really identify who is German or not. But they were German speaking, and as far as I learned, you had lots of even magazines and journals and newspapers in German, and German events and German clubs and all these things. And also we were talking about the Eagle Brewery. So was this also a German-based brewery? And did it have the name Eagle, or was it Adler, the German word, or did you find something like that?
That's a good question.
That's a really good question. I've only ever seen Eagle Brewery, but I wanted to say, and this is a German brewing family, so we'll get into that in a minute. But one of the interesting things is around this time period, and I think 19th century, maybe even early to mid 19th century, there's a shift in preference for beer from the research I've been doing that shows people are getting a lot more interested in lager. And that is different to brew, and the types of structures you build around it are different than you would for like the English brewing. And you, Marcus, probably know way more about this than me, but from what I've read, you need to keep it cooler because you have to allow, it's like, top fermented versus bottom fermented. So you have to let the beer rest and lager for longer, which means you have to build some way to keep that beer cool. And that's been really interesting for me to read about, because you can see, again, this recursive relationship between people and culture and the things they make and build. And that's, of course, where archaeologists are always getting interested. So the two breweries in town in Jacksonville, one being the Eagle Brewery we're talking about, were associated with German brewers. And we do see, and especially in this other brewery where there's still the ruins of all these lager caves. So it's really interesting to see, the type of beer that they're choosing to make definitely is reflected in the landscape and in the archaeology.
That really sounds interesting. This is the major change in the American brewing when they went from ale to lager. And as far as we know, or as I know, it is connected to the German people which were immigrating. And then they started around the 1840s, 1850s, the first bottom fermenting brewing lager breweries, and also the other ones, they kept on the top fermenting yeast but tried to ferment as cold as possible. And so maybe you know the term of the steam beer from Anchor Brewing, for example. And that's also a quite interesting thing, but maybe that's another topic for another podcast. But maybe if you have a look back on this German family of the Eagle Brewery, did you find out something about their living and their history, and were there also other breweries there and what happened to them? Did you find anything out about that?
So much. So I will say that there are some people that it's really easy to research. They leave behind lots of different clues. And then some people you just dig and dig and dig, and sometimes you don't find much at all. In this case, we found lots. Both of the people, both the Wetters, were born in Germany, and I'm not sure exactly when he came over. I can't remember off the top of my head, but in the late 1840s, early 1850s was when most of the brewers in Oregon immigrated to America. She also came over at that same time. Most of them landed, I guess. They were in Missouri or the Midwest for a certain amount of time. So a lot of the early people who were linked to brewing in Oregon came across on the Oregon Trail, one way or another. Some of them sailed. It depended on how much money they had, whether they could afford to go around by boat. So not overland by boat, but on the water by boat. So that was what she did. And she and her family settled in Albany, Oregon, which is, I could ride my bike there if I had some time. So it's really close to where I am now. And she was actually listed in the census as a cooper. So she was doing actual work related to brewing. Her father was a carpenter, but brewers lived with them. Her sister then married a brewer and stayed in Albany, Oregon. And they had, so Joseph and Frederica married in 1860 and lived in Jacksonville. He died. She lived a long time after he had passed on. They had lots of kids. He also left her with a lot of debts when he died. And so there are a lot of really interesting, important records related to the business and what was part of the business, because there was so much legal strife around it. So we have lots of information about what the property of the brewery was like. We have lots of information about, how many kettles they had or how many bar stools they had. There was also a lot related to them in the newspapers. And so there's a lot of really wonderful detail that kind of feels gossipy. It's very like so-and-so went to visit her sister, or so-and-so came to visit. There was one really, really great article that I found that I shared with Chelsea about a lightning strike. There was a lightning strike on the building, and it told how there was gold in the wallpaper, and that the lightning traveled through the wallpaper. And so we knew that this house had some definite decorative touches. So I think that's the thing about reconstructing this business history, but also this family history is it's Chelsea and I joke and Chelsea laughs that this is very much like archaeology, that you really are just you're finding little itty bitty clues, and then you're stringing them together to try to reconstruct what we think happened outside of the more traditional tax records or production records. What was it actually like to live in this place and be in this family? I think there's a benefit to Jacksonville being so, what's the word I'm looking for, Chelsea? Not stuck in time, but preserved, that there's a real preservation to the town itself, to the properties that are there, to the families that have lived there for a long time. So that's not the case in Portland. That's not the case in Oregon City. That's maybe not even the case in places like Albany, which are still smaller towns. There's just been a lot of change, and there hasn't been a lot of change in Jacksonville. And I think that makes it easier in a way because people keep talking about the same families and have stories to share.
And to kind of follow up on that thought, the original saloon that was adjacent to the brewery and part of it is still there and is part of the modern owner's residence. And across the street, this woman who actually is one of our volunteers, she works with us a lot. She grew up across the street and knew the granddaughter or daughter of the original brewers. So when she was a kid, they were pretty old, and so she remembered going over there and like checking out the brewery. So we were able to do like oral history with her too, just as a coincidence, because she was already coming out to help us on this project. So, there is those kind of connections that do help us tell this story. But I think that it is important to recognize that, archaeology can take many forms, and we're just looking at artifacts, which are things made for and used by humans at the most basic interpretation of that. And that's documents as well as things that we unearth from the dirt. And we were joking this morning about how going through the census records was really not that much difference for screening through all the dirt and we found 1 million nails out there at this brewery. So, all these little clues that in and of themselves aren't necessarily that groundbreaking, I guess a pun intended, or exciting. But when you start to add them all together, they all provide pieces to this larger story. And archaeology is always about assemblages and patterns and how things fit together to create like a context that you can try to build a story from.
And I think that's what is, for me, what's so important in thinking about these as family businesses. So not just thinking about them as men drinking with men, or men making beer that was consumed by men, or that they were allied with sin and vice, that these were, I think when you start looking at these clues that are left behind and frame them as family enterprises, it really requires that we reconsider what it is that we think about alcohol, period, but alcohol in the Wild West. And I'm doing air quotes, which no one can see.
That reckoning might also kind of tie into what happened shortly thereafter, which was the temperance movement, which was women trying to gain power over their relationship with alcohol and how it impacted their lives. So, this is not something I've done a lot of research in, so I can't really speak to it, but I just, as we're talking, that to me seems like there's probably a correlation in some ways.
that's something that definitely what surprised me is in Portland in particular, which grew vastly larger than any of the other cities that were established at the same time. By the 1890s, it was pretty out of control. Like it was that there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of drinking, and not in this sort of delightful German beer hall kind of way, but it lived up to its reputation from what I can tell.
Yeah, very interesting. And I can tell you there were not only nice days in the German drinking ages, so also a lot of fighting and things. And I just had an idea when you talked about the temperance movement. When we see pictures about the Prohibition era and all these times, we always see that the women said, okay, we don't want our men being drunk. It was never about themselves drinking. Mm-hmm. So, but I think there's also something which should be considered.
Well, yeah. And I think that that's really what it was women were often put in this position where they didn't control a lot of the factors that impacted their own lives and the way that alcohol played a role within it. For example, I think Frederica's story can kind of tie into this, because after her husband died and she ended up taking over the business, she remarried to an English gentleman a couple years later. And she clearly was fully capable of operating this business and expanded it into, continued to make alcohol as well as beer. And then when she married this new gentleman, it all kind of goes downhill. And there's accounts of him getting arrested for starting fights. There's all these, he claims somebody poured soap into all the beer. And if you kind of read between the lines, you start to think like, he maybe wasn't the best person to team up with. And her daughter in an oral history says that, when my stepmom or my stepfather came into the picture, he just didn't really have the background and we kind of got out of brewing. But I really think that, this woman had built up this business and worked really hard to save it. And then she remarries and the new guy just kind of drives it into the ground, and she's stuck in a lot of ways with the consequences of his actions. And so I think that's kind of the role that women, that's the kind of frustration that leads to the temperance movement. And really, when you look at that and the power it had, it is, women totally taking control over, new roles in politics and all the ways that they're influencing their communities. And several counties and cities in Southern Oregon went dry long before nationally. So that's another really part of the story of women and how they're responding to their environments and trying to take their power back.
I haven't done enough research yet to know, but I'm curious whether there was overlap between the women who were really pushing for temperance, and were they in the same community clubs with women who were married to brewers. And that's something that I haven't done too much research into, but I'm really curious about that overlap and whether the wives of brewers were linked to alcohol or whether they weren't. And that's something that I'm curious to learn more about, because I imagine that it could be miserable.
Yeah.
It seems that we are starting many new topics today. Somehow. But maybe shortly back to the Eagle Brewery. So was it the oldest brewery in the area, and how long did they brew? When did they stop?
Yeah, that's such a hard question to answer. So the first brewer that I have identified was in the 1850 census. He lived in Oregon City, which is the northern part of the state, which was then the territorial capital. He was from Germany. I never could find anything more about him. So that I don't have a brewery that was opened in 1850. It could be that he just identified as a brewer. The first brewery that I've been able to identify in Oregon was through a newspaper ad in 1854. That was in Portland. There was another brewery that was opened in 1856 in Portland. And then over the next several years, breweries opened in Oregon. So the person who opened the first brewery in Jacksonville was actually an Englishman, and the person who opened the first brewery in Oregon was an Englishman. So it's a sort of irony that like these firsts were Englishmen, and then the Germans just steamrolled over those stats later. So John Holman was the first commercial brewer in Oregon. He opened the brewery in 1856. I think we feel pretty confident in that date. In 1854, he was in a census without an occupation. And then the next year, 1855, he was listed on a jury roster with his occupation being brewer. So was he making beer? Probably. Was the commercial brewery then? I don't know. I think that's tough. There was there's this elusive sentence that I have found that I can't verify, that there was something in a newspaper, a California newspaper. So California and Jacksonville are really close to each other. So there was something in a California newspaper from 1852 or 1853 that he had purchased and was running this brewery in Jacksonville. So if that's the case, then it is, this Jacksonville brewery is the oldest in Oregon. I can't find that paper because they're really, really rare. And so I found different issues of it, but I haven't found the one that supposedly has this 1852 or 1853 date. It's feeling suspicious to me. Like maybe that was a mistype, or that I can't verify it until I see it with my eyeballs. I won't say that, but it definitely was one of the first, by far one of the first.
Yeah, and how long did they survive in the next generations? When did they stop brewing?
There's on the Sanborn maps, the brewery itself is listed as dilapidated, and all other accounts seem like by the 1890s, they're not really actively brewing anymore. And I think that there's two factors involved. One, like I said, the new husband did not make good decisions and was not a good partner. So I don't think he helped this situation at all. But the town of Jacksonville in general was in decline. The railroad, which was, in the American West, it made or could break you. If the railroad came to your town, you're golden. If it didn't, you are gonna, lose out to the town that it did go through. And so the town bypassed Jacksonville by about 5 miles, and they went into decline. And that is, so I think a lot of the businesses and stuff, folks either thought, well, let me move out of town, or we just don't have the consumer base to support it anymore. But that is one of the reasons why Jacksonville is so well preserved. It's what we call preservation through neglect. So there wasn't a lot of new development, and they didn't raise buildings to put new ones up. So things were kind of just left as they were by the turn of the century until the 1960s, when people started to recognize that it had its own worth as a historical landmark.
And there was another brewery in Jacksonville that was the City Brewery, which was run by Schutz, and he, from what I can tell, came as a dry goods merchant. So he was in Jacksonville, 1852, 1853. And he ran this other brewery, which seems like it started, I think Vetter started at that brewery and then sold it, and then moved to this location that he's at. I'm a little fuzzy on that. But that brewery, Schutz's brewery, closed when he died. He died in 1892, and at that point, that was when that business went under.
And that building did leave a bunch of archaeology. That's where you can see the logger caves really well, and this whole warren of brick underground, like stone and brick tunnels. And the building that was there was several stories high, and you can see kind of how they were using the innovations of artificial cooling to kind of facilitate making beer, which is pretty interesting. And that's another one that I've got my eye on for archaeology at some point, because I think that would be another really interesting place to look. And they had a brewery, saloon, dance hall kind of thing going on. And so that place definitely is central to a lot of this, Wild West kind of newspaper clippings that you read about all the fights and the rowdy parties and stuff there.
Yeah, and I definitely have to come over. I really want to see
Yes, please.
these lager caves. That really sounds very interesting. Maybe just a short question more. You just talked about making alcohol and beer. So was also distilling an important thing, not only brewing?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So they were definitely hard liquor was popular with the early white settlers for sure, all over Oregon. And so there was that, I think that kind of small scale brewing even before these named breweries. So they were definitely making all sorts of hard liquor. Both Joseph Vetter certainly absolutely distilled. And tax records and ads from newspapers show that he was advertising whiskey and brandy and the lager beer. And then after he died, in those probate estate records, there's information about the distilling equipment and how much liquor is on hand at that time. And the implication that I draw is that Frederica, his wife, essentially was saying, you can't repossess this equipment because this is how I'm going to make money. So let me keep this brewing equipment and this distilling equipment and keep operating it because that's how I'm going to be able to pay these debts. So to me, that was pretty clear evidence that she felt like she could make money making liquor.
And there are also accounts of I guess you say gauger, is that right? The guy who goes around and like checks the alcohol, what it's like. So there's definitely accounts of her producing apple brandy of a fine quality, according to this official that would come through and test it. So she was making brandy. And then just one other thing to kind of show how archaeology definitely reinforces this desire for folks to get alcohol out here. Before these breweries really got their footing and they were making, lager and alcohol, we found archaeological sites dating to the early 1850s that have the stoneware ale bottles and stoneware gin that is being imported from Amsterdam. So, and this is back when anything coming in has to come great distance, either on foot, human feet, or via like mules and stuff. So the effort it took to bring this heavy breakable alcohol out to these remote areas really showed you how much of a priority it was for these folks doing this mining out here originally.
They were committed.
Yeah, I can imagine. Very interesting too. So maybe as a last question, all your findings, all your work, did that change your personal view on beer and brewing?
Well, for me, it's still ongoing because we just finished working out there not too long ago. We have a few more things we'd like to continue to do. One of them is do some remote sensing to see if we can identify where some of the underground part of the structure was that's now a lawn, because there was, according to some documents, like a warren of like these caves and stuff the Eagle Brewery spot. So I'm still kind of haven't really wrapped my head around it fully, but the idea that families were living here and running this business definitely changed the way I think about it. And that is being reinforced in the archaeological record, in the buttons and the kind of the daily life type of artifacts that we're seeing. It's not just like saloon paraphernalia or anything like that. It's definitely, the domestic assemblage that you would assume where like a family was living. And so that's really what we're seeing archaeologically. And so that reinforces what Tiah has been, saying about these breweries are not what you see in the Wild West movies.
I think what really surprised me, I wouldn't say that it changed anything, because as Chelsea said, that was what I thought. So it sort of confirmed, I guess, what I was thinking. I think for me, so I've been interested in women in brewing, 19th century women in brewing for a few years, and have done some on-site research when we could still do on-site research before COVID. But the last year and a half, I've been doing almost all of my research, looking at census records online or looking at newspapers online. And I can find a lot. I think what really felt sort of overwhelming in a way to me was to be in this place. So the importance of actually going to the place where one of these women lived, talking to somebody who saw the house when it was still there. I think that was really important. There also was there's this in the saloon building, which is still there, there's a big post in the center that had the names and the heights of her children marked on it. And I thought, what an amazing record of the way that they were in this saloon building with the kids, marking how tall the kids were. And that I think that that felt that sort of wonderful connection of these were people and they were doing the same things that people now do, just because it was the black and white era. And they, didn't have internet connections where they could talk to each other throughout the world or connect with their families. They still did the same thing. And I think that was probably one of my favorite parts. The nails and the digging, that was awesome. But to see and be in that place was really special. And I think made them seem even more real to me as people who lived lives and did ordinary things.
The original slate billiard table is also down in that saloon basement, largely because it's too heavy to get out. But that's another really interesting connection to this past as well.
Yeah, so these old times really come back to life a little bit, and we really can imagine how these days were. And I really am very, very fond of coming to you and having some beers with you and talking about these times. And so for today, I say thanks a lot. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your information. And cross my fingers for your next findings, that you find interesting things. And I'm looking forward to maybe have another series in a few weeks or months and talk about the next things. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been really fun.
BierTalk, der Podcast rund ums Bier. Alle Folgen unter www.biertalk.de.